At the doors, a heated exchange takes place. Of a medical facility where a black physician is only halted by security for the whole, the surgical team will be waiting inside. Her leadership, what occurs when she questions are raised about authority in the most crucial period in her career. Let's learn more about Dr. Olivia in the comments below. Bennett hurriedly shifted her footwear, slamming onto the glossy tile floor of the text in the hospital parking garage. She was obviously patient in the emergency surgery for a serious condition was nothing new to her. Yet she needed this. Did she save people's lives in charge to ensure everything ran smoothly when things were going badly? But as she went to the entrance of the hospital, her concentration was broken by Anne stretched out. "Excuse me, but I'm a profound authority." Her steps stopped just as the voice called out to her. Just centimeters away from the entrance, a security officer, tall, broad-shouldered, badge-wearing Dude D. Reynolds, who read that, blocked her path. His posture was rigid and his face. Olivia's heart was already unreadable. Racing, but for a whole different reason now. Is there an issue with the reason she blinked? Although she spoke steadily, she knew Reynolds was the precise destination of this. Eyes darted across her navy blue scrubs the hanging hospital ID badge from the pocket of her coat. The confident, the stance of a lady who has been strolling down these hallways, yet his lips remained in a slightly curled position. He responded, "The firm visiting hours are over." Olivia breathed deeply as she moved an inch, already sensing the onset of frustration here. "I am Dr. Bennett, the head of I must have cardiothoracic surgery." The guard's eyebrows raised now inside. He seemed to hear something, just a little. His eyes didn't entirely make sense, scanned her ID, but rather than moving, "With that said, I'm not sure I've seen you." Before she tightened her hold on her ID, "I too busy for this. There's a patiently awaiting my arrival in the..." She attempted to go by him, but Reynolds moved, obstructing her way once more. "Please wait while I check this." Olivia's actions brought the seriousness of the circumstances that cause her patience to wane. Image and name are right there. Title: What precisely are you need to? Confirm that Reynolds squared our shoulders. Olivia took a deep breath of protocols, forcing herself to remain composed and not let this man to notice how incredibly familiar this seems. What protocols are those, and what was the moment? Precisely the ones that are unique to me. I'm simply doing it. Reynolds's jaw clenched. Her blood boiled there at my employment. It was the state, the all-encompassing justification she desired, wanted to yell and demand to know why he was hired, appeared to entail halting her. But not the other medical professionals who swept by. She looked without even glancing, searching for someone to observe who may raise their voice, but the entrance wasn't, save for the steady beeping of the automated system at the hospital. She could see doors behind the glass. Nurses racing through the confusion of control of her surgical team is responding to the situation. Doctors Simone Carter, Alan Park, and Ethan Morrison was standing close to the front desk. Their eyes are seeking, their features tight. After then, Alan noticed his eyebrows were raised in perplexity as he gestured for her to do so by tapping the glass. "Music, we urgently need you in here, Dr. Bennett." Through the glass doors he called. Reynolds cocked his head but remained still. Olivia took a minute to push her ahead and avoid him. Strong, authoritative voice, "Leave my..." The twitching of Reynolds' hand toward his radio, but he was unable to speak before. When the glass doors opened, Alan went outside. "Dr. Bennett." "What's the delay?" Alan worriedly queried his voice clip. Reynolds parted his lips as though to describe, but Alan didn't hold off till in response. He gestured with his hand. "She is the lead surge on an approach to Olivia. In an emergency. What on earth are you doing?" Twisting Reynolds' face for a moment, in an instant, he glanced at Olivia. Alan's ID badge, which he already had examined, something in him that appeared to click, and he retreated half a step. "I was forcing my lips into a narrow line." Alan snorted. "Just checking," he murmured. His frustration was evident, so he checked more quickly. "We won't have time for this the next time." Olive didn't wait for more information. She rushed on, tearing through the hospital doors with her heart racing. Ears. The moment she entered, a surgical report was forced upon her by the nurse. "The patient's hands are ready." And we are waiting on Dr. Bennett nodded, looking at the information that flips a switch in the mind. She couldn't afford to go into surgical mode. Think about what happened just now. Not now. When a life was at stake, she let it go. Remarked, already on the way to the O. But despite the fact that she was cleaning and ready for the process, that she could sense it hovering at the periphery of her. Remember that. The barrier wasn't new at the time, was the worst, and it wasn't unexpected. Portion, but the subsequent time. It occurred, she doubted that she could just walk. There was silence in the operation room, other from the constant beep of the tracking devices and the regular ventilation of the patient is resting quietly on the Olivia. Bennett had completed this table, many times the first cut, the careful use of a scalpel, the meticulous balancing act between accuracy and urgency, but tonight is different. Her veins throbbed with the annoyance, the humiliation of the interruption. Her hands followed east up, but her focus was on the moment outside those doors. Reynolds had given her the same look that his voice was tinged with skepticism. She had forced herself to shove it down. Working mode, but as she directed her team through the complex process, the pressure of its weight on her doctor. Bennett's heart rate as ribs. Dr. Park said. She nodded as she stabilized. Her professional vocal quality is good. Dr. Carter, we are into phase 2, suction. Modified the scrub and the instruments. The nurse gave Olivia precisely what she for the team to operate well. Lubricated machine doing every action with for a brief while. Precision allowed her to she nearly forgot, but then realized if she had been late, if she'd taken even 5 minutes more time spent outside debating this. The patient could have died. The insight caused her to grasp, the tighter forceps caused the air to feel heavier. We're closing up, she remarked at last. Advancing the last sutures were. The technique that was performed was an achievement. A life was spared, but Olivia never experienced such rage as she ripped. She removed her gloves and moved away from the edible. The rush of excitement started to fade. She started to feel tired, but she wasn't. She was simply physically exhausted, manner that became deeply ingrained in her doctor. Morrison gave her a smack on the bones. Returning as they left the another in the book's document, she included a little nod, but it didn't show on her face. The customary contentment that followed. Morrison scowled after the successful procedure. Everything was well, and she let out a deep breath. Truly the burden of what had recently, how easily it happened outside those doors. How had her authority been questioned? It felt usual to be halted in that manner. Started to. Apparently, the surgical staff had also witnessed it. Alan's manner of yelling at Reynolds. The way the nurses looked at each other was nonsense. Morrison, you don't have to say it, whispered as they approached. The Olivia shot back, caressing her as I lounged. Temples, since it simply sits there if I don't. I'm sick of letting things happen there. Morrison paused for a moment before sitting there. Speaking once more. Would you want to submit? Olivia voiced her displeasure with a humorless laugh and remark. What's that, a security? The guard didn't think a lady of color could be a surgeon who caused me to slow down in a life or death circumstance, and after that, what will happen? Apology, a pledge of improved instruction, and then another black physician the next week. Stops, and we have to start anew. Her voice's harshness startled me. Morrison nodded his jaw even at her. I understand. Tight, but that doesn't imply when it's correct it doesn't matter. Occurs often. And she wanted to shake. Let's end the topic and move on. However, when she rounded the bend she stopped suddenly at the break room. Although Reynolds was present, he wasn't stood by himself, arms folded and rigid, confronting Alan, who appeared to have recently been involved in a contentious discussion. Alan whirled at seeing Olivia, and his face lit up with relief. Doctor, he summoned Bennett and motioned for her to visit. Reynolds' gaze locked with hers for half a second later. He glanced. Olivia took a deep breath and forced it out, herself to continue walking even as she neared. I was only giving our this pal is halting the lead. Surgeon from going inside her own medical facility is more than just a safety measure in an emergency. Alan's comments were oozing with error. Sarcastically, Reynolds's jaw was tightly adhering to protocol, who Olivia cut the formality out of her voice. Reynolds shifted dangerously calmly. Regretfully, I didn't recognize you. There have been instances where people have attempted to enter covertly while posing as a staff member. She crossed her arms. I wasn't trying to be sneaky. I had in scrubs and had my ID out. Literally entering my hospital there. Reynolds was in a lengthy, tight quiet. Eventually, I let out a breath and massaged the back of. I didn't mean to glance at his neck, Dr. Bennett. Any disrespect shown by Olivia's expression didn't alter, but you treated me disrespectfully. Reynolds paused, but now that I understand you must to have completed your job well. She made a strong slash in her voice, since you were asking, maybe I should have been a patient here. Was there a glimmer of guilt in his dying? Reynolds' expression changed to one of awareness. However, Olivia had no interest in anything. Poor justification that he was developing. I'm sure I believe that this is over, as I didn't imply that it was sufficient, but it's not, since I've worked twice for years. As difficult to be perceived as sufficiently competent to be the owner of this title. But tonight that didn't matter. Not my qualifications, my stance, not the reality that people were waiting for me inside this hospital. Her voice was used to save someone's life. Steady, but she balled her fists. Beside her, you stopped me because you believed that I didn't appear as you had anticipated in Reynolds. That almost cost a life, Alan, who had been quiet, swallowed hard. Eventually said, so please tell me, Officer Reynolds, had she been a Caucasian woman would a lab coat have prevented him? Reynolds didn't respond to that response. Enough. Olivia gave a little chuckle. Yes, I do that, she said, shaking her head. Believed she pivoted, departing. Morrison followed him as he stood there. Pace you well after her, not even, I'm not sure what, she murmured. Enraged her even more since it or the reality that she had anticipated it, and she had a thorough understanding of depressed that it wasn't yet over. Olivia had left Reynolds behind, but the burning in her chest would not go out. The hospital was bustling with activity. Her nurses are running from one room to another. Charts that physicians consult on a regular basis managed chaos, but her thoughts were locked. It wasn't the first time she had been interrogated in an environment where she fit in and she wasn't sure it would be. She finally arrived at the staff locker room. I used more force to push the door open, more than is required inside the fluorescent softly. Buzzing lights throw sharp shadows cast by the locker rose she to take a breath to release the strain. Her body began to disintegrate before she yelled at the incorrect individual as soon as she turned. Simone Carter was in the corner, resting against an arm of a locker crossed. She remained in her scrubs. Pulling wavy hair back into a tight bun before Olivia could say anything, I heard Simone even talk. Olivia let out a sigh and rubbed her. Of course you did. Simone pressed your temples, Alan. She tipped her head off the locker, was about 2 seconds away from using profanity. Morrison and the man in the lobby. He appeared to want to toss. A chair. Olivia shook and breathed out a chuckle. I'm prepared to burn her head, and you the entire fucking structure. Under Simone's, Olivia knew her well, yet her voice was calm. Enough to hear the boiling rage below the surface. You're right, Olivia acknowledged that I'm not Simone. Nodded as though anticipating that response. So what should we do? Olivia sat and exhaled slowly. She leaned her elbows on the bench. I'm not familiar with Simone submitting. I've noticed that complaining seems meaningless. These training sessions on diversity. Nothing changes. It will still occur next week. Perhaps. Simone sat next to her once more, but perhaps it won't occur here once again. The next black doctor won't experience it. Olivia, who enters those doors, swallowed. Wasn't that the issue? The burden of being the one to be. The one who raised their voice to carry that burden in addition to all of her other, put up too much effort to be stopped at the entrance of her own medical facility. As before, she could say anything. Someone had invaded. Alan, the door slid open. Anything else? As well as Morrison Stroh, who appeared as. Did you speak to him about how tense she felt? Morrison's voice clipped Olivia as he inquired. If you might call it that, Alan. I nodded, exhaled while running a hand over his hair. In particular, such man is a liability. Didn't even understand what he had done. Or perhaps Morrison, he just didn't care that he did. Went over his arms in any case. It is intolerable that Olivia couldn't ignore this. She glanced. They were upset with them for her because Simone, it always meant something. Leaned forward and spoke more softly. Now that we don't disregard this, Olivia. Looking down at her hands, the identical ones that had used the same hands to save a life tonight, that a gatekeeper had stopped, who didn't believe she should be a decision. I'm going to report once she settles into her chest. Finally, she said. Not only him, the entire system that permits this to continue occurring, and if I don't, I'm just as those who turn their heads away. Alan nodded. Good, I'll support you. Added groan, will all be Morrison right away. Smirking, I believe Alan has already begun. Think of us as a riot in the break room. Olivia laughed in spite of everyone else. She was still frustrated. Her bones were still heavy with fatigue. But suddenly, she sensed something more. Determined, she stood and rolled her. All right, let's shake hands. They exited the locker room with a few items up, walking in unison. Yet this wasn't tonight. But it wasn't just about. It was all about them, and she was refusing to back down from the hospitals. The temperature in the administrative office was lower than Olivia couldn't recall the temperature. However, the sensation of the sterility of the framed mission statement should be placed on. The wall is covered in phrases like inclusion and equities derision. She was seated across from Dr. Patel, Chief Medical Officer of the hospital, with Morrison, and Alan Simone are at her sides. Reynolds sat across the room like a wall. His arms were crossed across his face stiffly. Dr. Patel folded, her gently blank hands together. Dr. Bennett, I get it. You desired to formally speak to the event that took place last night. Olivia, indeed, your security guard, without hesitation. Mr. Reynolds prevented me from going inside the hospital as I was traveling to carry out urgent surgery in spite of putting on my ID to prove my identity, and while wearing complete surgical scrubs. I was delayed in the guise of verification in the interim. My surgical team in Holo and my patient were waiting. Dr. Patel turned to Reynolds on me. Her face officer. Reynolds, do you have an illegible? Reynolds, having nothing to say, sat forward. His voice steady. I was doing it the right way. There have been instances of unapproved those attempting to obtain access to prohibited locations. I was only carrying out my duties. Olivia's jaw tightened once again. She took a long breath before conversing. But such procedures never appeared to be applicable to my white co-workers. Reynolds gave a little quiver, but Olivia kept being allowed alone, because that was sufficient. Evident that you didn't stop me because of procedure. You prevented me from doing so because when you spotted me in scrubs, you with a black lady saw someone instead of a surgeon have to check on someone you had to Alan. There was silence in the room. His voice was harsh, you knew, and he leaned forward. What I did last night when I entered, passed through the door after swiping my badge. Door. And nobody ever stopped me. Simone nodded, just as I did. Query, even if I wasn't in scrubs, Morrison laughed amusingly, saying, in as Olivia and he were still fighting. Along with him, and he didn't even examine me. Dr. Patel's eyes flitted. Between them, Dr. Bennett, I don't question your frustration, and I have no doubts about that. Circumstances such as these can feel. Olivia interrupted her again. Isn't an emotion. Rather, it's facts and realities. And it's risky, she said sternly. Bending forward, moment I was confined to if I had been 5. The patient was in danger. They may have perished a few minutes later, and Dr. Patel. What a misguided suspicion. I can guarantee you that this is a serious matter. We will be taking these issues carefully, reviewing the security processes. Olivia cocked her head and gazed, reducing an evaluation. Reynolds at last spoke once more. And I now realize that after pausing, realizing that I may have handled everything differently, Olivia allowed. She gave a brief, sour chuckle in a different way, placed both hands on the table as he stood. You realize how risky your hesitancy shown how careless it is to intervene between a patient and a surgeon. Due to your personal prejudices, Reynolds doctor. Patel cleaned her eyes. Hey, Dr. Bennett, what are you doing requesting Olivia Saint straighten true responsibility? Dr. Patel gently nodded, indicating Olivia didn't reluctance to require racial bias training, genuine training for security, not simply, a slideshow in the designated format, a complete examination of the employment and our security personnel's training procedures, and I would like this to make a public statement. The hospital admits what took place was unacceptable. Morrison and Allen. Simone looked at each other and then nodded, and Dr. Patel tapped her fingers in unison on the desk, breathing out. Olivia's lips are pushed rather firmly. Together, hence is being seen as an long-term invader at your own place of employment, Dr. Patel. There was a pause between them, then leaned back and massaged her temples. At last, she nodding, "We'll do that." Reynolds appeared to. Despite his desire to object, he maintained his mouth. Olivia closed her eyes and released the strain in her shoulders, somewhat loosening, but it wasn't. It wouldn't resolve every issue. However, it was a beginning. As they left, Simone bumped her shoulder at the office. Olivia shook her head, saying, "You did it, but we, in any case." Did Morrison smile? Allen grinned as he bought beverages. "Tonight." For the first time, you're absolutely correct. Olivia grinned for hours, although this wasn't for her. It was only a shift and a triumph.